Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Forced regime change playbook and why it is not and will not work in Belarus. Also, the Navalny saga. Who benefits from this very strange episode? To discuss this, I'm joined by my guest, Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He's editor of Politics First magazine. And in Budapest, we cross to George Samueli. He is author of Bombs for Peace, NATO's Humanitarian War on Yugoslavia. All right, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Okay, let me start with George here. George, let's start with the Belarus story, because the Belarus story looks like it's kind of morphing into the Venezuelan story of the Baltics, okay? Because we have this pretend or recognized from Lithuania, I think it is, this woman, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, that she's the president in exile right now. Are they pulling a Guaido here? Because I seriously doubt this wouldn't be happening if Mike Pompeo hadn't made a phone call. Go ahead, George.
Well, they are trying to pull a Guaido, but of course, the Guaido case turned out to be a complete fiasco. And it's clear that the Trump administration isn't terribly happy with the policy that it got stuck with, thanks to the pressure from former National Security Advisor John Bolton. So I have my doubts that they're going to pull a Guaido over this Tikhanovskaya, because it's just going to give them, is notable for the absence of pressure from the United States. The United States has been actually taking a rather reticent approach toward this. And without pressure from the Americans, I don't think this is going to go very far. So there's already indications that Lukashenko feels very confident of himself, and he's being his usual difficult self with the Russians, feeling rather confident that he's here to stay.
Marcus, I tend to agree with George. And on top of it, Lukashenko made it very public, particularly to Russian television stations, that he is at least rhetorically officially open to some kind of transition, though within the bounds of Belarusian law. That indicates to me that he's learned the lesson that he can stay, but he has to start thinking of an exit here. What are your thoughts, Marcus?
Let us be clear about something, Peter. Over the last few weeks, what we have seen in Belarus is an attempt by the West to instigate what the West calls a color revolution, but in reality is an attempted coup against a legitimate president. And indeed, in the former Soviet space, or what Moscow calls the near abroad, there have been many examples of so-called color revolutions. Georgia 2003, Ukraine 2004, Kyrgyzstan 2005, and most notably of all, Ukraine 2014. But the attempted coup in Belarus was always going to fail. Why? Because the overwhelming majority of the Belarusian population regard themselves as part of the Russian world. They see themselves as part of the Russian family. Secondly, Belarus, or we should call it more accurately, Belarusia, is a de facto province of the Russian Federation. And we have seen that in recent times because the Russian military, in tandem with the Belarusian military, has now sealed Belarus's borders with Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic states to prevent infiltrators from coming into Belarus from those countries. And also Russian special services working alongside Belarusian special services have now identified agent provocateurs of the West in, most notably, of course, Minsk. Now, the real question is, or should have been, not was the attempted coup always going to, was it going to succeed? No. What it has now done is strengthened Russia's position over Lukashenko, because had it not been for Lukashenko, then the Union states of Russia and Belarus, which was formulated between Yeltsin and Lukashenko in the late 1990s, would have come into being by now. But of course, Lukashenko has stalled ever since Putin came to the helm in Russia, because Lukashenko wanted to be the president of the Union states. But now that Lukashenko has remarkably and without precedent turned to Putin for assistance in preventing a coup, that now gives extraordinary leverage to the Kremlin to exercise over Lukashenko. So I actually believe, Peter, that inadvertently the West has actually played a pivotal role in what I believe will be the materialization sooner rather than later of the Union state.
Well, George, but that's the fly in the ointment here. I mean, and it's one of the things that I get very frustrated with in looking at the Western narrative on Belarus, because it's not about Lukashenko. It's about the place that we know as Belarusia, and its relationship with Russia. And as Marcus quite correctly and in great detail discussed, this is a single state, okay, at this point here. And the problem is it's been Lukashenko unwilling to implement every single phase and stage of that he signed up to. And so this is the unreported narrative that what's going on in Belarus, because it is kind of a Lukashenko problem, but for very different reasons. Go ahead, George.
Yes, that is right. And the policy before the election, which was engineered by the EU and the United States, was to try to foster as much division between Belarus and Russia as possible. And that made a certain amount of geostrategic sense. Whatever makes life difficult for the Russians, NATO, the United States regards as a good thing. Let's give Putin as many headaches as possible. But by overplaying their hand in Belarus, as Marcus has quite rightly pointed out, they have now strengthened the bond between Russia and Belarus. And you're getting the impression now that the Europeans are sensing the foolishness of their policy and are now trying to draw back. Because I do think it's striking that the whole of this propaganda on behalf of Tikhanovskaya and having all these attractive women around and everything, the propaganda to try to get, oh, this is the Belarus that we want to recognize, this is the legitimate government of Belarus, that's failed, that's gone nowhere. So it looks to me like we're maybe heading towards the pre-election policy of, well, let's try to foster division. But I think that's extremely unlikely to fail. I think that train has left the station.
Speaking about division, I mean, if you look at the reaction of the European Union member states, it's the whole Guaido scenario it's really been given a cold shoulder, because we're not going to go through this again. I think we also have to point out is that the European Union as a whole has Ukraine fatigue. I mean, look what the resources and time that they put into Ukraine, and well, they kind of got a milquetoast version of what they wanted, okay? Because the fundamental reforms that Ukraine needs is not happening right now, and again, just the billions and billions of euros that went nowhere, I personally think, into people's pockets. So, Marcus, how much do you think that plays into it? There's kind of a fatigue, at least on part of the Europeans, about this regime change playbook?
Well, the European Union is naturally a rival to the United States in economic terms, but ultimately the European Union is a strategic friend and ally to the United States. Indeed, we can say that Washington exerts a tremendous amount of influence over EU policymaking. And I would cite at the beginning of 2014, when America placed sanctions on the Russian Federation because of the crisis in Ukraine, which incidentally America was responsible for. The European Union, obviously led by Germany, was very apprehensive about wanting to place sanctions on Russia. They did resist, but in the end, the European Union caved in to the pressure from the United States. And I think if we fast forward to 2020, what we've seen in recent times in Belarus. Yes, the European Union is certainly playing a role in that. It's certainly the case that Poland and the Baltic states, which are very dangerous countries for Russian national security, have actually facilitated the attempted coup in the country. But I think ultimately the hand of Washington is responsible for what we have seen in Belarus. And I think that, Peter, the Americans are actually emboldened by their triumph in Ukraine because, yes, vast amounts of money have been poured into Ukraine and lost. I mean, Ukraine is one of the most corrupt countries in the world, and it has been ever since it became independent in late 1991. But nonetheless, Ukraine, as we talk now, is integrating with the West, and Ukraine is the greatest foreign policy challenge to the Kremlin. So I think the Americans have felt emboldened by their success in Ukraine, but they obviously did not do their homework sufficient enough to understand that Belarus is not Ukraine, and Belarus is, as I said, de facto a province of the Russian Federation, or you can put it, it's a Russian protectorate.
You know, George, Marcus just said that Washington doesn't do its homework. I think that's kind of an understatement because they screw up every step of the way here. No, you're right, Marcus. I mean, Washington is emboldened, but I think emboldened in the sense that it can create a quagmire, okay, where you know, Russia has to take the burden here. It's not a success in a nominal way. It's like, oh, well, we screwed up that neighborhood. It makes the neighborhood unstable. That's a victory for us, which is a very cynical foreign policy. Go ahead, George.
Yes, no, that you've hit the nail on the head there, Peter. That's exactly what the American thinking. It's a quagmire. So whatever way it goes in Belarus, the Americans will say, well, that's a triumph because it's a headache for the Europeans because it's right there on their border. It's a headache for the Russians. So therefore, the Americans say, yeah, okay, you know, and what's the solution? More America. Because obviously it shows that the Europeans are unable to sort out their own problems. So it's the same, you know, you see that same scenario played out in Iraq and Syria and Libya, and you say, okay, it's your headache, not ours. So
no, but what it is too is that then you, in all these cases, you capture elites in specific countries, okay, and they even thwart it within their own country and within the union here. Okay, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on some real news. Stay with our team. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing some real news. Okay, Marcus, let's go switch gears. Let's talk about the strange case of Navalny. I mean, the more we learn or don't learn about this story here about the alleged poisoning of Mr. Navalny, which is seen in the West as kind of the leader of the Russian opposition to the political status quo. I would like to preface before I ask the question is that he hardly has much of a following in Russia, which, you know, of course, Western media would not tell their audiences here. But it seems to be, you know, who do you want to believe? And I think this is really what the origins of this strange case is about. Who are you going to believe? The Russians said that this gentleman left the country with no indication that he'd been poisoned, and then German officials say just the opposite, but at the same time not releasing to the public what kind of information they have that would prove that allegation. So it's kind of a political football, and it's really more about something else, but I want you to react to that so far. Go ahead.
Well, firstly, Peter, there is no political reason for the Kremlin to want to assassinate Navalny. Why? Because Navalny's standing in Russian society is absolutely negligible. At all strands of Russian society, there is a deep loathing of Alexei Navalny because he is perceived by the ordinary Russian man and woman as being a forward column of the United States, of someone who wants to return Russia to how it was during the 1990s, by which I mean subservient to the Americans. So he has no standing whatsoever amongst ordinary Russians. Secondly, there is no economic reason for the Kremlin to want to assassinate Navalny, because that would inevitably jeopardize Nord Stream. And the Russians do not want anything to affect Nord Stream. Why? Because Nord Stream constitutes a very significant source of revenue for the Russian government. Thirdly, Peter, you don't have to be a scientist to understand that if someone is poisoned with a nerve agent, for example, Novichok, and especially in the confines of an aircraft, then people around the person who has been poisoned are naturally going to be contaminated. Yet in the case of Navalny, none of the passengers adjacent to him, none of the cabin crew, none of the people who treated him were contaminated. Thirdly, if the Kremlin had attempted to assassinate Navalny, why on earth, Peter, would they have allowed him to travel to Germany, knowing that the German authorities, being strategic allies and beholden to the Americans, would allege that he has been poisoned by the Kremlin? It is absolutely preposterous nonsense. There is no reason why the Kremlin would want to assassinate Mr. Navalny. And on top of that, I would say this to the Germans. If they are so certain that Navalny was, someone attempted to poison Navalny by using Novichok, and according to the evidence of the Germans, it goes back to the Kremlin, why does Berlin not allow Russian medical doctors and scientists to travel to Germany and for the German authorities to share their medical and scientific findings with the Russians? It's as simple as this, Peter. If you have nothing to hide, then you have no reason whatsoever to not share your findings with a third party. And on that basis, what we are seeing regarding the allegations surrounding Navalny is part and parcel of an ongoing, concerted and vicious campaign against Russia, because Russia is a superpower again, and that is what the Americans and the British loathe.
George, can you spell Skripals? Because we've been all Skripaled again, okay? The lack of transparency here. But let's get to what I think this is all about, and Marcus has already mentioned it here. This, in my opinion, this is my conjecture, is that this is just this one final attempt to derail Nord Stream 2. This is what this is really about, okay? And it's putting the Germans in a very hard place, because Angela Merkel has made it and she's on the way out, and she's made it very clear during this entire process that this is an economic, legal agreement. This has nothing to do with politics. She said that, and she pushed it based on those two principles now. And really, whatever is behind this gambit here wants the Germans to break their word and break their agreements, okay? Which, unlike the Americans that will do it in the drop of a hat, the Germans feel very uncomfortable about that. And I think the pressure is not on the Russians, the pressure is on the Germans right now. Go ahead, George.
Well, yes, and there's obviously a very strong division of opinion within Germany. You have the German military and security establishment that is thoroughly embedded in Atlanticism. They're close to the Americans, they're integrated within NATO, and they have absolute every interest in trying to destroy this, the Nord Stream 2 deal. However, you also have the German business community that stands to make a lot of money on this. And it's important to remember this agreement, this Nord Stream 2 agreement, was a German initiative. This wasn't a Russian initiative. I mean, it was the German.
They already had a pipeline.
Yeah, that's right. One. Yeah, exactly. So the way it's often presented in the media is as if it was somehow this is a favor for the Russians. No, this is a favor for the Germans, who have very serious problems with energy. They've made a complete mess of their energy policy, so the energy is extremely expensive in Germany. So they really badly need this cheap source of natural gas. So for the Germans now to scrap this agreement would be a very devastating blow. But the Germans haven't done what the British did over the Skripals. I mean, the British were very skilled at mounting a kind of global propaganda campaign. They went to the UN Security Council and denounced the Russians. They organized this diplomatic expulsions and so on. The Germans haven't done this. Now, it may be that the divisions are so deep in Germany that they're unable to do it, or maybe that the Germans just simply are not convinced by the, by the whole Navalny case. But again, it's as we were saying with Belarus, it's what's striking is the lack of the driving force as yet that took place of the Skripals. The Germans haven't yet mounted that kind of wild, hysterical campaign that the British did.
Yeah, but they're losing the momentum if they don't continue here, and that's why I think that Merkel's pragmatism will come through, which she's going to say, but this is just an economic. I mean, we haven't even mentioned the consumers. I mean, it's a boon for German consumers as well. Okay, since Germany has moved away from coal and from nuclear. But Marcus, one part of the story when we look at Nord Stream 2 is that why do we have these underground gas pipelines going through the Baltic? Oh, that's right, because of what happened in Ukraine, okay? I mean, this is just a foreign policy chasing its tail, okay? With the illegal overthrow of the government in 2014, is that it flipped Ukraine's strategic role in the energy equation of Europe, okay? And so the Russians said, look, you stop stealing it, this is not for you, and then Ukraine would use it as a political ploy to play everyone off against everyone, and the Germans and the Russians said, no, we don't need to play this game, that's your game, okay? It's more Washington's game too. And so we need to consider why these pipelines came into being in the first place, because of the quagmire that was created in Ukraine, and it doesn't serve Europe's interests whatsoever. Go ahead, Marcus.
I think we need to acknowledge, first of all, that Germany heavily depends on Russia for natural gas. For its economy, of course, its industry, but also for the ordinary German man and woman at home. And I believe that 65% of Germany's gas actually comes from Russia. So that is why Germany in 2014 was hesitant to place sanctions on the Russian Federation, because it is certainly not in the interests of the German economy for there to be a rupture in cordial ties between Berlin and Moscow. And in 2020, it is not in the interests of Germany for Nord Stream 2 to be ruptured. But of course, the Americans couldn't care less about the German economy. In fact, they would quite like to see the German economy become weaker. Why? Because that would be the Americans. But I think also as well, the Americans are acutely aware, and so of course is the Kremlin, that the Russian economy, robust that it is, one of the largest in the world that it is not a diverse economy. The Russian economy is still overwhelmingly based on energy and defense exports. And by attempting to scupper Nord Stream 2, that is the way of the Americans, not the Germans, the Americans trying to weaken the Russian economy and ultimately trying to asphyxiate it. The Americans know what the weaknesses of the Russian economy. As the Americans, Peter, knew in the late 70s and the early 1980s, the weaknesses of the Soviet economy. Hence why one of the reasons why Reagan embarked on a massive arms race with the Soviet Union, because he knew the Soviet economy, well, not him, I don't think he knew much about politics in general, but the people around him knew what the weakness was of the Soviet Union, and that could bring the Soviet Union down. And I think by trying to scupper Nord Stream 2, that is the way of the Americans trying to bring down the Russian economy, because they know the Russian economy is still not a diverse one, not like the American economy or the British economy.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, George, this is, and I think, this incident has really put into stark relief of the importance of Europe. Do they want to have energy independence or not? Do they want to have a say in their energy sovereignty? Because Washington would love to have the Europeans buy liquefied natural gas at astronomical prices, okay? When Europe, for the most part, is living in austerity, and then the whole point is to get affordable energy. Liquefied natural gas isn't. Last 40 seconds, go to you, George.
That's right. So it's yet another price that the Europeans have to pay for NATO and the Western Alliance. You're going to now have expensive energy. It's in your interest to have cheap energy, but you will have expensive energy. Just like Ukraine, you're going to have the headache of refugee flows, economic crises, and so on. that's your price of loyalty to NATO and the Western Alliance.
Okay, gentlemen, that's all the time we have. I want to thank my guests in Budapest and London. I want to thank our viewers for watching us here at RD. See you next time. And remember, CrossTalk rules.